Welcome back to the Drive for History. It's week 3, and this week we're highlighting machines from the glory days of American motorcycle racing. Today in front of us, the 1919 Harley-Davidson Fast 500 Flexi racing sidecar. Ultra rare machine, and as you can imagine, the bike still fires up and runs absolutely perfectly. Now we're here in the board track racing exhibit at Wheels Through Time. Dozens of machines from the earliest days of American motorcycle racing. By the 19-teens, Big 3, Harley, Indy, and Excelsior were spending big budgets, big resources to develop factory racing machines to compete at a lot of the big events around the country. By mid-19-teens, by the late 19-teens, sidecar racing was really kind of a mainstay at a lot of these events. As the sport continued to develop, the sidecar of choice became quite clear. It's the flexible racing sidecar. So, Flexible Sidecar Company was located in Loudonville, Ohio. Initially began building Flexis. The company was actually in business all the way up through the 1990s. They made buses, all sorts of odd things, but started out making sidecars there in Loudonville, and the place that Flexi gets its name, or the reason that Flexi gets its name, is because of the articulating nature of the sidecar. It's actually a flexible, leaning sidecar. So traditionally, when you're on a sidecar motorcycle with the third wheel out there, it's real rigid. You know, you steer the bike. The thing about the Flexible Sidecar Company is that allowed the rider to operate the motorcycle like a motorcycle. So you can still lean it, and it handles very much like a regular bike instead of a Harley. As such, would become a common mount for the guys racing these sorts of things. Now, this machine, ultra cool story. I found this bike in 2011 in somewhat dilapidated condition. My wife and I, actually, it was the very first trip that we ever took to go pick up a motorcycle together. We drove from Maggie Valley right up to Marshall, Michigan. Now, this bike was raced out of Battle Creek, Michigan, up through the 1930s. Now, what we're looking at is a factory racing chassis, what we call a short-coupled Keystone frame factory racing motorcycle. So this machine was built in the Harley-Davidson racing department, and then the sidecar would have been added later. So motorcycle made in Milwaukee, sidecar made in Loudonville, Ohio. So now, one of the neat things about this bike is actually you can see, and there's so many pieces of this motorcycle that were kind of pivotal in choosing whether we restore the bike or preserve it as original. And one of the key factors is right here on the sidecar. Believe it or not, you can actually see the guy's name that raced it. So right here we got Cliff Palmer, and then there's a lightning bolt here, and down low you can just barely read it, you can just barely make it out. It says Battle Creek, Michigan. Got the 4 holes here on the door for his number plate. Just an incredible survivor piece of history. Proud to have it here at the museum. Now the sidecar itself, ultra skinny, you can barely fit a person inside of there. Now the thing about sidecar racing, incredibly dangerous. You know, when you're sliding sideways through a turn at say 70, 80 miles an hour, well, the guy on the bike, he gets himself in a pinch, he can bail at any point. The guys in the sidecar, whole different deal. You're really trapped in there, and for some guys during this period, it was in fact a death sentence. So incredibly dangerous, many casualties from flexible sidecar racing, to the point where actually, I think it was in 1919 or 20, they outlawed the monkey. They called the passenger the monkey. They outlawed having a passenger in the sidecar during the race altogether. They'd actually keep a ballast or a sandbag up in the front to keep weight in the sidecar. But super neat piece of work. It leans really as far over as you'd want to lean. Now, the way that the sidecar works, it's really a neat setup. It works with what we call knee joints. So right here in back, and if you get a view of both sides of the sidecar, the knee joint itself is right down here on the pivot. So there's a rod that goes through the frame of the sidecar that makes sure that both the sidecar wheel and the motorcycle lean and work together to the exact same amount. So you've also got stops here that allow you to kind of preset the maximum lean angle of the motorcycle. So the thing will set right there, and really one awesome piece of work. Now, as special as the sidecar is, one of the things that really makes this bike among the rarest machines in the museum is the engine. And This is what we call a fast 500 racing motor. It's not 500 cc's, it's actually 1,000 cc's, standard displacement limit for the classes back then. So any twin cylinder Harley racing machine of this era would likely be 1,000 cc's. So based on the narrow case racing engine platform, Harley Davidson in 1915 beefed up their crankcases. Bigger flywheels, bigger crank pin, bigger and longer connecting rods. As such, the top ends were also different, being that everything on the bottom end was a little further away from center, valves moved further away from the bore, cylinders were redesigned. Very quickly in 1915, Harley-Davidson realized that some of their potent 1914 motors were considerably faster. So 1915, 16, 17, all the way up through 1923, for Harley-Davidson's single-cam racing engine, they operated on that 1914 engine case, what we call a narrow case racing platform. So the cases themselves are narrow like the 1914 cases, skinnier flywheels, smaller crank pin actually with lighter, smaller rods. That allowed them to bring the bring the valves back in closer to the bore. So it is a thing about side valve engine. With the valve on the side of the piston, this distance in between, it's kind of like a hallway, you know, as air-fuel mixture gets let into the engine and then as exhaust gets expelled out of the engine, that distance in between the valve and the bore being a hallway, so the shorter the distance, the faster things move. So Harley-Davidson quickly realized in 1915, keep those valves close to the bore. It's one of the things that makes an overhead valve such a potent setup. So Harley-Davidson quickly realized this in the 1920s on their racing motorcycles. When the valve is over the piston, there's no hallway, so things happen ultra fast. But pocket valve setup, right here you can see the VIN number 19A700. So anytime you see that sub 1000 serial number, that's an indication that it's a racing engine. So year 1919, it's what we call an A motor. And then all of the racing engines started at 501, which is where they get their 500 designation. So this machine being 700, 19A700, I doubt highly that there were 200 or anywhere close to that amount of these type of engines built that year. Traditionally, when they start a new series, so they start with the factory numbers 501, 502, 510, 514, and then traditionally you see with each 100, it's kind of a new series. So 700 may be the first of a new type of series. Say might have been the first of the flexible racing factory sidecars. So incredibly rare stuff. Again, almost every component of this motorcycle is factory racing stuff only. It's as rare gets. Now, one of the neat things about this bike is when Haley and I found this bike, made the trip all the way up to Michigan, the bike didn't have an engine, okay? Now, any 1915 to any 1914 to 1924 Harley-Davidson engine would bolt right in. But here at the museum, we like to do things the right way. Really, rather than immediately start sticking parts on this bike, we waited some amount of time in hopes that we would find a proper racing type of engine. Now, if I could give you an idea of the rarity of this motor, a good friend of ours, Daniel Statnikoff. Daniel Statnikoff is kind of one of the pioneers of board track racing motorcycle collectability, I should say. Daniel's been into the board track racing motorcycles for decades. Daniel and I were talking about 2-3 years ago, and we counted between the two of us, we know of 12 of this type of engine. 12 of them out there. 7 of them are right here at Wheels Through Time, if you can believe that or not. So, and then maybe a few more of them at the Harley-Davidson Museum. Just a handful of these motors out there, period. So to find a 1919 factory racing engine was not something we expected to happen, but as it would be within about a year's time, we had been contacted by a fella that actually had a 1918 Harley-Davidson that he wanted to restore. Sent us pictures, and the spare motor that he had with his project was, yes, the 1919 factory racing motor. So as it would be, we'd get it all put back together, and believe it or not, I took this bike out in 2012. and raced it with my dad on the Indian Daytona flexible sidecar. Now, the Indian over here behind us, guys, will be running this bike sometime here in the future on Drive for History, so make sure you stay tuned. This bike was owned and raced by Pop Dreyer. Pop Dreyer was kind of the ultimate sidecar racer of the teens and 20s. Dreyer was based out of Indianapolis. This is his special factory Indian flexible sidecar mount. Ultra rare Daytona Power Plus racing engine, just a handful of this type of engine, set into what we call a Marion frame. So this frame was given its name after the Marion Road race in Indiana. It's basically Indian's version of the Keystone frame. So what you see here is the tubes here end right there in front of the engine. There's no loop cradle underneath the motor, as we said with the Harley stuff, and it's the same on the 1919 over here. What that lets you do is drop that motor considerably lower into the chassis, give you a lower center of gravity and a better ride. So really, really neat setup. And then the third of the Flexis that we had out in 2012, our good friend Mike Lang. Mike has a 1929 factory Flexi with great history. It's really known since the day it was produced. Mike's actually got factory photos of his flexible racing sidecar before they ever put the motor in it in Milwaukee. So really, really neat stuff. First time, as I understand it, it was the first time in maybe 70, 80, 90 years that 3 flexible racing sidecars were out on a track at once. So ultra neat stuff. Now, some of the cool stuff that came with this bike, and this is where we get really heavy into the motorcycle nerd stuff, guys, so bear with me. This wheel here, again, one of those determinants on whether we keep it original or whether we restore the bike. So this is the sidecar wheel that came, or excuse me, this is the sidecar wheel that came with the flexible racing sidecar. Now, as you can see, the old Firestone Racing cord tire has fallen off. That's what a tire looks like without the rubber. You can see the cord and the weave. Now this rim, as you can see, is not usable. It's rotted all to pieces. The spokes themselves still got all the spokes in them. The spokes are actually, where the spokes cross to keep them tight, they'd actually wrap wire around the spokes and then solder that to keep this kind of a solid joint. Now, the ultra rare piece here is the hub. Now the hub is specifically designed for the flexible sidecar. The wheel is such an intact piece of motorcycle history. Ultra rare racing tire, racing rim, racing hub, the cool spokes. It was just one of those pieces that we decided, you know what, it would be a shame to tear this all apart just to harvest the hub and relace a new wheel. As it would be, we happen to have another flexible sidecar racing wheel here in the teen shop, so that bolted right on. Now, another thing that this bike came with was an authentic pair of drop racing handlebars. These handlebars are so incredibly rare. They're in original condition, and traditionally what happens is that a lot of these races, the sidecar, check it out, Steve, the sidecar unbolts with literally, you pull a cotter pin, you pull the pin, you undo one bolt in the back, the sidecar comes off, sidecar comes off, and you've got a 2-wheel race bike. Pull the handlebars off, stick in the drop bars, and you can be competitive in the 1000cc 2-wheel class also. So super, super rare, ultra wide factory racing gas tanks. The big Flexi bars, they keep high handlebars on the sidecar races. You get a lot more leverage. So it was really, getting out and racing this was really surprising. I didn't know what to expect. You know, you ride a sidecar around and you can feel the rigidity. That chassis doesn't want to move. This is exactly like riding a motorcycle. It's virtually no difference. I can't tell you one thing, it doesn't turn right. That's a story for another time. Anyway, we're gonna get this bike fired up. Right now, it's been since until just recently, it's been since 2012 that we ran this bike. So I fired it up about 2 days ago when we were getting it ready for this video segment. And we're back there on the rear stand. And again, guys, no brakes, no clutch. Most of the board track racing bikes, in fact, almost all of the board track racing bikes here in the museum, direct drive motorcycles, they were made to go and that's it. So rolling starts would be the same with the sidecar class, and then keep her wide open the whole time. shut her off with the kill switch when the race is done. So over on this side, really easy starting procedure. Now with the no brakes and the no clutch, we spin that rear wheel to fire it up, as some of you guys might have seen with some of the other board track racing bikes here at the museum. So the carburetor here, I've got the choke on. This is an HX style carburetor. Now this particular HX, incredibly rare piece. It's one of the small bore early ported racing sleeve carburetors. Right here you can actually see the ported sleeve, check it out. So the way that these air intake mechanisms work is there's actually a tapered leather flap on the inside of the carburetor here, on the inside of the throat, that's spring loaded, okay? So the air is pulled in through the mouth here, and the spring itself is part of what determines that air fuel mixture. So in order to choke the bike for cold starting, we tighten that spring up, and it allows that air fuel mixture to be a little bit richer. Now, as you get to high RPMs, these types of carburetors, they're really limited in their ability to get fueled in air to the engine. So what they actually did before deciding to open up the throat and deal with a different emulsification tube, they actually use these ported sleeves, and you can see what you're opening up is extra air to be able to bypass this leather flap and get into the carburetor much easier. So high RPMs, real easy setup. You can turn that thing and open those air ports and change your carburetor mixture. So what we're gonna do, we've got it choked. I'm gonna close the ports back down. We've got the fuel on. We're gonna tickle that carburetor a little bit and then preset the throttle. And hopefully we'll be running in a couple pulls, guys. Now this is magneto ignition. There's no switches. Fires up relatively easy. 45-degree Bosch racing magneto. And I think we should go. We've got the decompressor off. Got a clean pair of Harley Davidson racing spark plugs. We'll retard the spark just a bit and preset the throttle and give it a pull. There we go. Oh, too much fun. See, flashbacks to 2012, last time I was racing it. One of these days we'll get the trio of them out again, but incredibly rare 1919 factory 500 racing sidecar. Guys, make sure you're tuning in more this week, next week, and the weeks after. Drive for History is ramping up. We're bringing you all sorts of rare machines right here from Wheels Through Time Museum. Make sure you check out Wheels Through Time, support the museum today. Remember, y'all keep us the museum that runs. Thanks a bunch.